Our reading today comes from the 4th chapter of the book of Ruth. No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there than the next of kin of whom Boaz had spoken came passing by. So Boaz said, "Come over and sit down here." And he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the town and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. He then said to the next of kin, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling a parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, but if you will not, tell me so that I may know. For there is no one prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you. So he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also acquiring Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance. At this, the next of kin said, I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in the former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. The one took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, acquire it for yourself, he took off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnessing today that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses. Then all the people who were at the gate along with the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem, and through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and when they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, bless the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a great restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Aminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. May God bless this reading. Well, if you needed to know, I never took Hebrew in divinity school. We are finishing up the book of Ruth today, and I couldn't help but think, when I was thinking about Ruth, about this thing that used to happen to me when I was a kid. And I wish that it was something that happened to me only as a child and not as an adult, because I had this terrible habit as a teenager especially of in the morning, the alarm clock would go off, and I would roll over, and the first thing I would do in the morning is reach out and try to find the snooze button. You're just smashing around on the radio alarm clock. And nothing has really changed in my life, except that now instead of an alarm clock next to my bed, it is the button on my Apple Watch that I have to squint to read to make sure I'm hitting snooze and not off, which I wish I never mixed those up, but I do from time to time. But when I was a kid, I would roll over and try to snooze the alarm clock, but it would always be set to NPR, because I've been a nerd my entire life. And I can still remember some days waking up, not finding the snooze button soon enough, and getting to hear Paul Harvey tell his morning story. Maybe some of you all are familiar with Paul Harvey. If you're not, Paul Harvey was a storyteller who would come on the radio a couple times a day for like 40 or 50 years. And he was famous for telling these stories in which he would tell it and it would sound familiar and you would go, I know this story, but where do I know it from? And then he would always end with the big reveal and you'd go, oh, that's the story of so-and-so. But he would end it the same way. He would say, and now you know the rest of the story. And it was dramatic. And I loved it. And if I was awake enough on any given morning when the radio would play his stories, I loved listening to them. I wasn't always awake for them. But I remembered these sleepy moments today as I was reading our passage because in a lot of ways, this last chapter of Ruth sounds like a Paul Harvey story, where there are these weaving pieces, and you're kind of wondering, well, what is this story about? It is a lovely story, but what is its greater purpose? And it ends with this genealogy in which the children of Ruth and Boaz become the ancestors to David, and you can almost hear, and now you know the rest of the story. You got to look it up. He just says it like nobody else can. But this story today, it begins with this interaction. We have kind of felt this coming as we have read this story. Boaz goes to the next of kin and asks him about buying this field that belonged to Elimelech. You know, they had this conversation the night before, Ruth and Boaz, in which Ruth told Boaz, you will go and have this conversation with this man, taking charge of her own story. And he tells the story and asks the next of kin, will you buy this field? And oh, by the way, it comes with Ruth, a woman, which is kind of again, when women being owned is just a theme in the Bible that it is a good thing that we have left behind. But I've read at least one commentary that thought that this scripture probably had some humor in it. There was probably a little bit of poking fun at the system of its day, including the taking off of the sandal to show that you have purchased a property. There's almost like a tongue-in-cheek, like things way back then were weird. Even they thought that. But the story works out, and Ruth and Boaz end up together, and they have children, and their acts of faithfulness are rewarded. And we find out in the story that they're rewarded not only in that moment, but their faithfulness to one another, and Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi becomes part of the family tree of David. And for us as Christians, the family tree of David becomes part of the family tree of Jesus. And so the end of this story is this reminder that the Bible is made up of these dozens of books. And they're books that tell stories about individuals and about groups living life. Some of these books are historical accounts of the people of God, and some of them are historical accounts of famous individuals. Some of the books are songs and liturgies. Some of the books tell stories of people getting the rules of God right. Some of them tell the stories of getting the rules of God wrong. And some of the books are almost certainly myth, events that nobody's quite sure actually happened, certainly not the way they were written down. But when we read these books, there are always these two ways of reading what is in the Bible. There are the stories that they tell. So like we would say the book of Ruth is about the story of Ruth and Naomi's faithfulness to one another. And it is the story of Ruth and Boaz and their romance and the way that they come together in love. But then there's another story that they are telling. And it is the much bigger story, the story of how these books fit into the story that Scripture as a whole is telling. There are the accounts of the individuals and the events that happen in their lives, and then there is the larger narrative of God's action in the world. And the books of the Bible always tell both stories. Ruth is the story of a young man who makes a powerful commitment. But it also becomes the story of Israel's most important lineage. It tells the story of unconventional love between a Moabite and an Israelite. But it also tells the story of the way in which God shows up over and over again, even in ways that people can't see it happening. And there's a word for this in Hebrew. The word is hesed. The word hesed loosely translates to faithfulness or loyal love or loving kindness. It's the kind of love that starts off this story of Ruth, right? She makes a decision of hesed to go with Naomi. The kind of love that says, I will stick with you even though I can't see where this is going. Hesed is that act. But in the Bible, hesed is not just the act that individuals make to one another, but rather it is also more commonly used to describe God's actions. God is the one who is faithful. God is the one whose loving kindness fills our lives and our story. God's the one who is at work even when we are not aware of it. And hesed is the word for that, for the ways in which God is working not just in our stories, but through them and beyond them. To talk about hesed is to talk about the ways in which our stories, like Ruth and Boaz, are part of a larger story. It's a story we can't always see, but it is always there. It's the part that comes before, and it's the part that comes after the final line is written. It is the rest of the story of how God shows up in our lives, in the generations, and how God will show up even in our lives today. Now, the trouble is we don't always see this bigger picture. We don't have a vantage point in which we can see how our lives will connect to the rest of history. Maybe we see moments in our lives where we make a decision, but we can't always see how those decisions will add up over time. And so we have to decide to love even when we don't know where it is going, which is very much what the book of Ruth is about, because we don't always get the bird's eye view. Hopefully it's something our descendants can see. But it is so rare to get a look at our lives from a big, broad picture that it's almost unusual when it does happen. I was listening to a podcast recently that retold the story of Alfred Nobel. I had heard this story before. Maybe you had heard this story. Alfred Nobel, probably you know his name from having the Peace Prize named after him, the Nobel Peace Prize. Have you heard of it? But Alfred Nobel in his life was known for something else. When in his lifetime, his family owned a factory that produced explosives for working on making caves, tunnels, construction. But they had a problem at the time that nitroglycerin, which they used, which was a powerful explosive, was also incredibly volatile. And so nitroglycerin created a lot of harm because workers who needed it to build tunnels or to make construction projects would handle it, and if they handled it the wrong way, it would go off at inopportune times. And so what Alfred Nobel was famous for was figuring out how to mix nitroglycerin with other chemicals to make it more stable and useful. And he named his product dynamite, which is still used today. Of course, it wasn't just work crews who found dynamite useful. Dynamite became an effective tool in fighting wars. It was a much more effective way to cause harm to other people. And so it's not exactly clear what happened, and this part of the story may or may not have happened, but the way that it is told is that when Alfred's brother died, the newspaper accidentally published the wrong obituary. And Alfred Nobel woke up to his obituary being published in the local paper. And the title of that obituary was, "The Merchant of Death is Dead." So Nobel, the story goes, had thought that he was inventing something that significantly improved the world. Having this explosive that you could handle that didn't go off when you were trying to move it, he thought would improve the world. What he didn't anticipate was that that explosive became the root of a new way to fight wars. And so, getting to see where history would remember him, Nobel decided to donate his enormous fortune to the creation of a peace prize to be given out every year. And what's remarkable about his story to me is that he gets what we don't get, at least a part of it. He got a view of his life that showed where his decisions had led, and he wasn't happy with the conclusion. He had made what he thought were the right decisions, and they resulted in a legacy that did not paint him in a good picture. Now, we don't get views of our life like this very often. Nobody misprints our obituary. I don't think anybody has my obituary pre-written. But it is a difficult perspective to have. And of course, Alfred Nobel did not have a total picture of everything. He would not know that 100 years later we are still giving out his Peace Prize to deserving individuals and groups around the world. He did not know that his name would become synonymous for peace. Because what he had is what we all had. He had the option of deciding that his next action would be oriented towards love. Regardless of what had come before, he could decide that his next decision would be for peace. And that's all we really get if we're honest. Our lives are just one decision after another in which we are given the option of deciding for or against love. Regardless of what has come before us, we can't actually go back in time and make different choices, even if we now know more than we did then. But we can decide that our next action, the one right in front of us, will be lived for love. And we can trust that if we do choose on behalf of love, if we do make the decision for hesed, for loving kindness, for loving faithfulness, that our individual action, no matter how small it feels, will be joined together with God's hesed, God's loving faithfulness. Ruth did not know where her story was going when she made the loving commitment to Naomi. But her story was a part of God's story. And so what is your story like today? Has your story gone the way that you expected? Have there been some unexpected twists and turns? Are you somewhere that you planned to be or maybe didn't plan to be? Or are you just feeling lucky to be here at all in this moment? Because there are all sorts of ways in which we measure how our lives have gone, successes and failures, and the whole lot of in between that most of our lives are made up of. Like the story in Ruth, we have moments of famine and moments of plenty, moments of feeling like we have it all figured out, followed by moments of disorientation. And that's what this story of Ruth is all about. It is about making the right decision that is right in front of you, seeking to make your next act an act of love. Sometimes it won't feel like enough, but it's all that we can do. We can choose to live our lives and act with hesed, with loving faithfulness, with knowledge that our small collection of actions accumulated over our lives will be added to the hesed of God. Every story in the Bible is the story of people making decisions that they can't see the result of. We are in their line, in their legacy, in their tradition. Amen.